Hi everybody, this is Jerry McHugh with the San Juan SJIQ for April. We took off in March with spring break and lots of work. So for April, we'll have two things. One, we'll show here pretty quickly, is a more popular one of our webinars with Dr. John Constable. He'll talk about energy and wealth, what the United States can learn from EU and UK's headlong foray into energy renewables. Secondly, we'll have a new IQ showcasing two San Juan Resources Mancos drilling projects. So the Energy IQ will focus on what we have here at this company and on the emerging Mancos in the San Juan Basin. In this email, I've also included some excellent blogs, websites, podcasts, Substacks that I believe are so important for those of us in the energy industry to know about, with facts, truth, and correct stories on our energy and our energy policy choices we're making. Anyway, great to see everybody for April, and we look forward to another month of upcoming podcasts. Good morning to everyone. On this edition of the San Juan Energy IQ, I'm Jerry McHugh Jr., San Juan Resources, and welcome and thanks for being here. Many of us have watched in wonder about Europe's aggressive energy switch to renewables, coming to roost recently with the Ukraine war, how certain European countries have been held hostage by Russian natural gas and oil, and the growing energy crisis, and a host of excessively costly electricity rates plus oil and gas prices. We can't help but notice EU natural gas price in excess of $50 per MMBTU compared to the US $4 to $6 per MMBTU. And we've been as low this a year ago as low as under $3. We'll delve into this with our guest from the United Kingdom, Dr. John Constable. It's the first time we've had a guest from Europe, so this is very exciting. John's been researching and reporting on results of this headlong push into renewables. You'll be able to find presentations also on our website. Dr.
That's effectively what it is. And we should get away from the sense of wealth being needless consumption.
Also, submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of
pure
the Zoom
Veblen
window.
goods, mere exhibitionism.
Welcome,
Wealth is human.
John, to this April edition of the San Juan Energy IQ. I'll let you introduce yourself. Tell me where you are, where you've come from, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jerry. It's a great pleasure to be on this podcast with you. I've done quite a number in recent months all over the world, but the first talking to anybody with really practical experience in the oil and gas industry, mostly think tank and commentary people rather than people with practical experience. So this is a particular pleasure for me. My background and how I came to be a prominent commentator in the UK, well, that's rather strange. I'm a lapsed academic. I am out of the humanities in Cambridge. I've taught in Japan as well. And I was working on the philosophy of aesthetics, which seems like a very strange predecessor for working on energy. But actually, to me, the jump is not so large. I was actually working on concepts of order and disorder in language, and particularly in verse forms. And that background meant I had to learn a certain amount of physics. And one of my big publications were written with physicists. And that meant I had some insight into the energy problems, which first came to my attention in about 2004-05. And I realized immediately that they were in many ways more pressing and more interesting, the things I was working on in aesthetics. And so I jumped ship. I left Cambridge and started to help direct research and publication for a then new charity publishing information about the renewables sector, Renewable Energy Foundation. I'm still running it, and we subsist on private donations. We're a small shoestring organization. And you might think that very odd that an organization such as that should become so prominent as a critic of the renewable industry. Well, there are two ways of looking at it. Firstly, that there's no particular reason why a charity with renewables in its name shouldn't be critical. After all, we have many cancer research charities, and as far as I know, they're not pro-cancer. So we try to be objective about it. The other is that our position has changed over the years. Initially, when I started working on this, I thought that renewables were overhyped but worthy. I've come to think actually they're a serious problem in our political economy, that they're threatening to our stability, our societal wealth, and that we have to be really much more realistic about this. And my contribution to it is fundamentally philosophical. I've been trying to think through the philosophy of wealth and the relation of energy to wealth, and I think I've made some progress on it. And my perspective enables me to say that actually the current climate policies, however well-intentioned they are actually desperately dangerous to the maintenance of acceptable levels of wealth in our societies.
Well, great introduction, and we're glad to have you. Having been in the San Juan Basin for 40 years, we're a producer focused company, and many of our guests and audience is in the production sector too. Just a little background for you. Our basin is the second largest basin in North America for natural gas. In the past 100 years, we've produced 55 TCF and 450 million barrels of oil. We think that conservative estimates are the basin has gas reserves in excess of 120 TCF of gas and oil reserves in excess of 1 to 2 billion barrels. So we're a domestic U.S. Exploration production company, and many of the people listening come from that perspective. So we wanted to hear about your perspective, Euro renewables. What can we learn can we have a look around the corner to see what the UK and the EU are learning right now? So kind of to set it off, one of my first thoughts is, how's it going? Costs, subsidies, what's working, what's not?
Yes, well, it's, you talk about what can the US learn from the European experience. I think the thing to admit, first of all, is that we are not learning from our own experience yet. We have been very slow to actually notice what has happened. And indeed, it may be that you'll see it first. You'll have the benefit of objectivity. You can look at what's happened in Europe with a cold eye. You won't feel any kind of reluctance to see problems, which we have. But I think I see it fairly clear. It's been extremely expensive and it's not been successful. We've been subsidizing renewables very heavily since the early 2000s, and the absolute quantities have now risen to very high levels. I mean, it's renewable electricity alone, for example, in the UK alone, is subsidized to the tune of just over 13 billion US dollars per year, and that will continue for quite some number of years. Now, in a population of 65 million people, that is a very significant level of subsidy. So it's costing every household £100, £140 on their electricity bill, and some invisible costs on their household expenses, because all the other consumers in the economy pass through their costs ultimately to households as well. But those costs have not been compensated by significant reductions in the costs of renewable energy. And some people find that surprising. Some people even deny that there is still a problem. I mean, the British government officially thinks that the costs of renewables have fallen very dramatically. But when we look at the audited financial statements of renewable energy companies, we find that it's not true. That in fact, their capital costs have remained very high, and their operational costs, the OPEX, still very high indeed, and in some cases rising. Offshore wind, which is of particular interest to the US, of course, because you have these grand plans for offshore wind. The offshore wind OPEX costs are still rising. Now, to me, that's not surprising, because the quality of the input fuel, the wind and the sun, is very low. It's a very high entropy source. It's close to random heat. Turning it into a very low entropy delivered resource, electricity to the consumer, is going to be intrinsically expensive. You're trying to turn a sow's ear into a silk purse. That's never going to be cheap. Or to put it more technically, there has to be a negative entropy flow, a resource flow, which corrects the defects of the sun and the wind, turns it into a high-grade fuel. And the contrast with oil and gas is very sharp. Now, you think of the fuels that you and your colleagues are extracting in the San Juan Basin. These are extremely improbable physical configurations. the oil and gas is a product of evolved organic structures. They're really improbable molecules, very high grade energy, very low entropy substance. And it can pay for its own extraction, conversion, and delivery to consumers. Whereas renewables can't. They have a very low energy return on energy invested ratio, whereas you have a high one for oil and gas. And that means that the things you're taking out of the ground can create lots of other improbability to benefit human beings. And that's the core definition of wealth. What is wealth? It's an improbable state of matter in relation to a human requirement. So a few minutes ago, Jerry, you said that you and your colleagues had extracted so many trillions of cubic feet of these wonderful things out of the ground. I think of it slightly differently. To me, it's just not a volume. I think of all the improbability that those fuels have created in the human sphere, all the improbable states of matter that have been made possible and therefore have benefited the people who've used those fuels, all the good you've done, in effect, all the wealth you've created. Because the root meaning of wealth is Anglo-Saxon, it's wealth, it's human well-being. That's effectively what it is. And we should get away from the sense of wealth being needless consumption or showing off or simply pure Veblen goods, mere exhibitionism. Wealth is human well-being. I know we waste some of it, quite a lot of it perhaps, but much of it actually is purely necessary for protecting our lives. We have an iron dome over us which protects us from pathogens. We live in very clean and healthy environments. Very few of our children now die. And the historical record shows very high rates of mortality for children until relatively recently, well into the 20th century, in fact. And so the improbability of your fuels is what means that you can deliver improbability to the consumer. The trouble with the renewables, which we are observing in Europe, is that these are very low-grade energy sources, which are intrinsically expensive. So that's the philosophical background. What's actually happening in Europe? Well, we're still pressing on with renewables. And indeed, in response to Ukraine, some politicians, notably Mr. Johnson, our Prime Minister, are saying that we need even more of them. But in fact, that isn't the case. Renewables have caused many of the problems we're currently observing. That may seem paradoxical, but the argument is quite clear. We have a fuel diversity problem in Britain particularly, and in Europe more generally. We're critically dependent on natural gas. We've become critically dependent on natural gas because only natural gas can work with very large renewables fleets. So we have a lot of wind and solar, and we have the absolute quantities of energy coming out of those wind and solar fleets are large, but they offer almost nothing towards security of supply. Security of supply hangs by the single thread of natural gas in Britain and more broadly in Europe. And consequently, when renewables slump, as they did in 2020, renewable production was way down across Europe, natural gas production jumps up, or it has to, the demand for it increases. And so there was a price crunch there. And that has been a significant contributor to the difficulties. That predates the invasion of Ukraine, and it was a problem before it. Ukraine simply brought all this into a much sharper focus. So the evidence is all there to see in Europe. It's just that we in Europe ourselves are not very good at actually admitting that we've made errors about this. Governments, by definition, of course, don't admit making errors, and they never make errors, of course. But the public is slow to wake up to the difficulties as well in Europe, but we're getting there. I mean, more and more people are beginning to question the underlying economics. And I myself have published work through our charity, Renewable Energy Foundation, which highlights many of these difficulties, particularly the truth about capital cost and operational cost for offshore wind. And indeed, if there was one thing I would point the audience to today, it's the studies that we've published. They're freely available on our website about true CapEx and OpEx experience for offshore and indeed onshore wind in Europe, because I think it's so important for what's happening in the US right now. President Biden and his colleagues have very, very ambitious plans for offshore wind on both the east and west coasts. It will be astonishingly expensive for the US, particularly so because you'll have to put so much on the west coast and that'll be floating. And floating offshore wind is maddeningly expensive. We know we have small quantities of it, but it's incredibly costly, even in relation to conventional monopile structures driven into the seabed, which are also very expensive.
So you did your study on initially on the or not initially, but more recently, you've mentioned that you have a wind published article that's out onshore and offshore.
That's right.
Can you talk a little bit about that? What some of your findings are?
Yes, we will.
Where can we get it, or do we have to be a subscriber?
No, you don't. It's freely available. It's that you can just go onto the REF website. That's www.ref.org.uk, and you'll find all the publications there free of charge, including a very large database giving performance data for every single renewable generator in the UK at very fine resolution, actually down to about a month in many cases. So it's very useful. The best data set in the UK, I'm pretty sure. Well, the publication to which I'm referring about, the OPEX and CAPEX for offshore and onshore wind, was motivated because we were seeing very, very low bids for subsidies, contracts for difference schemes, actually. And this enabled the industry and the government to say that the CAPEX, the costs of offshore wind were falling. And of course, from theoretical positions I've outlined to you, the thermodynamic position, I didn't believe that that could be true. And I decided that I wanted to commission research to look at the underlying financial costs. We knew that the audited accounts were there. It was just a question of spending time looking through them, actually putting them into usable form. And we found an econometrist at the University of Edinburgh who was deeply interested in these subjects, and spent about 2 years collecting audited accounts and putting them together for 350 wind farm companies. And he then worked on these it's a complex statistical and mathematical analysis, which extracts what you need to know about trends in CAPEX and OPEX, allowing for all sorts of fluctuations, which are also important in the accounts. And what we found was that, in fact, CAPEX had not fallen in the sort of way that would be necessary to justify the very low bids that had been made in the contracts for difference auctions, and that OPEX was actually rising. So the bids would not be enough to make these schemes economic. So the puzzle that we are facing now is, why did those companies bid so low? They're not economic. We can see that pretty clearly from their audited accounts. Why have they bid low? Well, there are several explanations for it. I mean, we're realists. There are all sorts of strategies in auctions, and we think that these companies were attempting to gain market share, which they've done. They've got a market position, and they've inhibited competition. They've generated some very bad PR for nuclear and some very good PR for themselves. And they probably, in the longer term, expect a bailout. So they've got the market position. Once they've got their feet under the table, they think that government will be so reliant on them that in 5 to 10 years' time, when they need an extra top-up or a bailout, government will not be able to refuse it to them. Some colleagues of mine say that actually, no, the explanation is simply that the wind companies have believed their own public relations, and they think that actually they're genuinely economic, in which case they're going to get a very nasty surprise.
So are these public companies? Are they?
No,
they are private equity, government funded. How do they keep going?
There's a bit of variety in there. Onshore, they tend to be private companies, shareholder owned, but offshore they tend to be state enterprises. So one of the biggest of them, Ørsted, which was Danish oil and natural gas, is largely a state entity. And yes, that's true, it's relevant. So state companies, of course, have different sorts of balance sheets to private companies. And it may be that they can afford these kinds of gestural economics rather than something that's fundamentally viable. We can't be sure about that. It's conceivable that they're mistaken. It's conceivable that they regard this as a short-term public relations strategy for the green agenda. They may even believe that actually their pretense will actually generate the outcome they desire, so that yes, they know their costs haven't fallen, but if they can only grow a little bit more, yes, their costs will fall. So it's a sort of optimistic strategy. As I say, from theoretical basis that I've taken about thermodynamics, I just don't believe it can happen, and we'll see who's proved right.
Are they so when the rubber meets the road and the electricity is delivered to the the community or to an area. Have there been brownouts? Have there been shortfalls? We talked earlier that the natural gas has filled the gap, but you also said that there's not a lot of combined cycle gas, that's been rather depleted in the country as well because of
that's an extraordinary factor about the policies. We have policies which drive in renewables and therefore make us very dependent on natural gas and on combined cycle gas turbines. But simultaneously, those policies have discouraged exploration and extraction of natural gas within Europe. And also they have suppressed the adoption and the installation of the latest generation of high thermal efficiency combined cycle gas turbines, which are necessary to work with renewables. Consequently, we do have a very distorted system, very disturbed indeed. So we're importing a lot of natural gas, and we have less thermally efficient combined cycle gas turbines, and perhaps not really enough of them to serve the market well. So yes, balancing costs have risen very dramatically. So in the UK system, I can give you exact numbers, I happen to have them in my head. Balancing the UK electricity system in the early 2000s would have cost around about 400 million UK pounds a year. It's now costing between 2 and 3 billion UK pounds a year. Now, I can't say all of that's down to the presence of renewables, but a large part of it is. So it's become much, much more expensive to balance the UK system. And some of the prices being charged by fossil generators when they step in to support the system are astonishing. And we've seen prices up in the high of £3,000 to £4,000 a megawatt hour. A typical wholesale price pre-2019 would have been about £50 a megawatt hour. So you can see astonishingly high prices for balancing. And for the consumer, this is just relentlessly bad news. It's just simply not a very effective way of doing it. Have we had blackouts? You asked about that. We did have a significant blackout in 2019, and that was caused in part by the weakness of renewables. There was a lightning strike on a line in the Midlands, and this caused a lot of embedded renewables, mostly small solar, to trip. And there was a cascade trip in that area, and a large offshore wind farm also tripped at the same time. And it caused a blackout which affected a large number of consumers. It was off for quite a whole day. Cost was extreme. It was extraordinarily embarrassing. But the renewables industry worked very hard to put the blame on lack of system reinforcement, that wasn't ready to hold all these renewables. I think more realistically, we can see that renewable companies were unwilling to spend enough money on fault ride-through technology, and they weren't under sufficient pressure from the regulator to be good grid citizens and to have all that fault ride-through technology already built. What's going to happen in the future? I'm not predicting blackouts in the UK. I think that we're still at the stage of throwing money at the problem. The question is not whether the lights are going to go out, but whether the consumer will be able to afford to turn them on. And we're going to see very, very high costs for consumers, and we already are actually seeing them. So no blackouts, I think, yet, but yes, we're already seeing stratospherically high costs.
Yeah, and talk about some of those costs. I mean, pounds and dollars, they're almost the same. I think
1.3, yes.
1.3, right. Talk about your electricity costs. Where have those gone
well,
for you guys?
Well, they've roughly nearly doubled, partly because of the high cost of natural gas due to our extreme exposure post-Ukraine. But they were rising before that. So a large part of the cost increase has come through the expansion of the grid wire system and the balancing costs. So we're now building very large grid transmission lines to bring renewable energy from the north, windy Scotland, relatively windy Scotland, down to the centres of load in the Midlands and the London area. And those lines are very expensive, but because they're built only to connect wind, they are underutilised. So we've just finished completion, or a few years ago, of a £1 billion link from Scotland to England, Hunstanton to Deeside. And that line is solely to serve wind. But wind has a load factor, even in Scotland, of only about 25%. These are low productivity assets. As a consequence, the grid line itself is underutilised. So it's very expensive. We're now looking at putting a couple more grid lines on the eastern side of the country, even larger ones, to do the same job. They will similarly be underutilized. So our transmission network use of system charges have also risen alongside our balancing costs. And these are all showing up in the overall rates that consumers pay, not simply in the wholesale costs. I mean, these are in the overall charges that are charged to all consumers indirectly through their bills. And the costs are high. So yes, the unit prices are rising significantly, but only a small part of that is caused by the wholesale price of fossil fuels. A very large part of it is now caused by subsidies to renewables and also all the ancillary services which renewables have made necessary. So balancing services and transmission expansion as well.
Wow. So UK versus other EU countries. I mean, I know you're not in the EU anymore, but other European countries, how have you guys fared compared to other places? I mean, we all hear about Germany, and they're supporting the war by buying all the gas from the Russians and just to keep the lights on. Who knows if they'll ever be able to make fertilizer or produce anything in the future, just because their energy costs, manufacturing costs are skyrocketing.
Yeah, so the Europeans are exposed to natural gas just as we are. They are in some ways in a better position. The Germans have a lot of coal, and they're still using it. If you look at the total primary energy charts for Germany, you'll see that basically it's a coal, oil, gas economy still. I mean, they are the principal apologists for renewable energy in Europe. They've driven the policy in the EU, but in some way they've been able to afford to do that because they have so much coal in their system. We don't. We've said goodbye to coal. We have hardly any coal in the UK electricity system, and we use hardly any for thermal heat in industry. And that's, of course, quite remarkable since we were the first country to really adopt coal on a very large scale. No, but it's now part of our past. Whether we'll go back to it, it's an open question. I mean, I'm now saying in public that I think that a prudent government would see that nuclear may fall behind schedule, it's happened before, and that we really ought to be planning to build ultra supercritical coal in order to guarantee security of supply in the medium term. But the Europeans have that. So in some senses, they're in a better position than we are about this. They're also, of course, a very large grid network, so that you have the ENTSO-E European grid network, which we are attached, but our interconnection is relatively weak in comparison with that of many other European states. So they're in a slightly different position to us. We're more exposed in many respects. And this exposure was predicted. I mean, I was writing things with engineers in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, saying that the renewables policy was in effect a gas policy and that this was dangerous. Gas is a great fuel, but no sensible person wishes to be overexposed to any single fuel. And that's the mistake we've made. To a degree, the Europeans have avoided that a little bit, partly due to their coal resources, partly due to the interconnection, which means that they can trade more extensively.
Okay. And is there any homegrown coal anymore, or is that all? Are your coal reserves imported? I know you do have natural gas capabilities.
Yes,
there's been huge protests against any sort of drilling.
We still have quite a lot of fossil fuels left in Europe. Not enough to make us fully energy independent, but certainly enough to bring the price down and to have a significant impact on security of supply.
Security supply, yeah. Right?
Yes, that's quite true. So the UK has a fair amount of coal, and many of the European states do, in fact. I think is it 10 to 13% of the world reserves, proved reserves of coal, are actually in Europe. Many of those are going to be in Germany. Of course, quite large coal reserves in Ukraine, as a matter of fact. And it's interesting to note that in passing. Now, there is great
natural gas, you told me, right?
And there's a lot of natural gas there as well,
which could in Ukraine, right?
Yes, but there's a lot of natural gas elsewhere. There are very considerable shale gas reserves thought to be present in the United Kingdom. We currently have a ban on shale gas exploration in the UK. And in the middle of an energy crisis, it does seem rather perverse to have a ban on a domestic resource of that kind, particularly when it's not theoretical, and we know that it can be extracted. You've done it in the US and it's been extremely successful. So why aren't we trying to do it? Perhaps it won't work for us, but we should definitely try. But at present, the government is not admitting that this is necessary. They're claiming that we can do it all with renewables. So there's a certain amount of gas, there's quite a lot of coal left. We're not using a great deal of coal now, but at present rates of extraction in Europe, there is enough to support 300 years more coal extraction. So there's lots of headroom. We could enlarge coal production in Europe and certainly have a very significant effect on security of supply and prices. And the same is true for natural gas, and possibly also in a more limited way for oil. The oil resources are less favorable, but there's certainly a great deal of natural gas around, and we could be extracting it rather than importing it from Russia, as many of the European states are at present.
Well, unless you get out and drill, your muscle memory is not very good right now. You know, that's what happens. I mean,
yes, that's
you need that practice, that time to drill and to have equipment, personnel, and everything which goes along with that. It just doesn't happen overnight.
Absolutely, you lose that accumulated complexity. This goes back to my earlier interest in what wealth actually is. We talk about capital very loosely, but capital just means complex states of matter of all kinds. It's not just buildings and bridges and such things, but it's states of mind, and it's institutions and coordinations of human activity, and the social replication of knowledge of how to do things, how to drill, and how to drill economically and effectively. And we've seen this in the United Kingdom. After all, we were one of the first adopters of nuclear energy, and a leading nation in civil nuclear. And now we have almost no nuclear engineers because we haven't exercised that muscle, and it's wasted away. And we're now in the face of a position where, if we want to build nuclear power stations, and we do, doing it domestically is going to be tricky. Rolls-Royce has some ideas, but in fact, de facto, it will rely on quite a lot of technical input from the rest of the world to do it. And indeed, for the large-scale nuclear power stations, we're looking really to French and latterly even to Chinese help, although the government has now decided that it doesn't wish China to build nuclear power stations here in the UK. So yes, the lack of exercising the muscle and letting it waste away in the oil and gas industries, well, we've done that with nuclear. We've seen it's a very bad idea. I hope it doesn't go any further in the fossil fuel extraction businesses, because I can see that in the near future, we may need those industries very badly.
Right. So we talked in the pregame a bit about the Industrial Revolution. You've done a lot of work on that, and really understand and articulate how wealth has been generated, really due to the fact of the energy being so plentiful and becoming a large part of society. And can you talk about that a little bit?
I'd be happy to. I can really bore for England on the subject of the English Industrial Revolution. It's my special subject. And the first thing to say about it is not to be patriotic about it. The English Industrial Revolution is a misnomer. It wasn't solely English. It was Northern European. It wasn't solely industrial. It affected all aspects of the societies that were involved in it. And it wasn't a revolution in any meaningful sense of the word. It took several hundreds of years, and it's still ongoing. So we've really misunderstood the English Industrial Revolution because it never happened. It's a much broader phenomenon. In fact, it's a phenomenon in which the United States is a very key player, because the growth, this is what Professor Wrigley at Cambridge calls the path to sustained growth, was one that was trodden by Holland, England, and America almost simultaneously through the 17th and 18th centuries. But it has roots that go right back into the medieval period and the progressive adoption of coal, particularly in the northwestern corner of Europe, and peat in the Netherlands. So these were superior mineral fuels. So they're very dense, they're low entropy fuels, of course, to harp on about the thermodynamics. And the advantage meant that the energy sector could be very productive. So it could be small in relation to the rest of the economy. And that is one of the key changes in the societal structure of societies that adopted or have adopted mineral fuels, that the energy sector is small relative to the rest of the economy. In an organic economy, and indeed in a renewables-based economy, it'll be the other way around. The energy sector is very large in relation to the rest of the economy. There's not much non-energy sector. And I can illustrate that with a key statistic. In the 18th century, 75% of the English workforce worked on the land for the aristocracy and gentry. And the land was the energy resource of the time. It was so it's a solar collector producing food for human and animal muscle. Coal replaced land as the energy source. Now, the coal sector was large, of course, but the rest of the economy was even larger. And that's the key observation. So the overall economy grows, the energy sector shrinks as a proportion of it. So even though people talk about big oil, but it's dwarfed by the rest of the economy. So it doesn't have that huge socio-political power, which land, which was the energy sector in the organic economies, had. And I fear that if we push renewables in, what we'll see is a reversal of that. You'll see that the energy sector comes to dominate our societies. And I think it'll be very politically very unpopular. So that's the key observation from the English Industrial Revolution. It's the change in societal structure, which these high productivity fuels cause. And indeed, I think they probably also explain the emergence of human liberty. It's not accidental that three of the societies which are most closely associated with personal liberty, that's the Netherlands, England, and the United States, all happen to be early adopters of these mineral fuels. So the Netherlands with peat, Britain with coal, and then the US, slightly odd case, but the US used machines made in Britain to burn timber in the US. So initially the American economy was wood-fueled for much of the 19th century, and even by 1900, 50% of all energy in the US was timber, in fact, but it was burnt in machines that couldn't have been made by anything other than a coal-based economy, steam engines in practice. No. So think of the Industrial Revolution if you must, but think of it as a very long phenomenon in which the United States has actually a very interesting and key role quite early on, even in the 18th century.
Well, the father of geology, Sir Smith, I'm forgetting his last name. He was the one who discovered all the geologic formations in the UK as he was building railroads and canals as an engineer, and really set the modern world of geology going. And I think we talked about this earlier as well. The United States has been blessed with abundant natural resources. I mean, we're only 3 or 4 time zones, at least in the main part. Just incredible resources and rule of law. We were able to have a lot of freedom and independence to strike out on our own with many people when as you say, the Industrial Revolution moved on further.
Yes, I go back to this point about human liberty. I mean, I grant you it's very important economically. I'm an economic liberal, a 19th century style economic liberal, but I don't think that it precedes wealth creation. We can see wealth creation in authoritarian societies, and they may remain authoritarian and they deny themselves the kind of autocatalytic effect that liberty can produce. But you can become rich and not be a free society. But wealth will create freedom, and it creates freedom by reducing competition between individuals and also expanding the human niche. It gives people choices, things that they can actually do. As I was saying, in the 18th century, nearly everybody worked for the aristocracy and gentry. You didn't have much of a choice about what kind of living to make. With the advent of coal, all sorts of more occupations, many more occupations emerged in the economy. And you can see this in the British social structure very early on, actually. It's surprising to people, but 50% of British energy in 1700 was coal. So we were heavily dependent on coal long before what people think of as the classic Industrial Revolution. Coal was a significant part of British energy, even in the early 1600s. And it's part of the story for the increasing diversity of employment types in British society through the 17th century, part of which, of course, fueled the resistance to the authoritarian Stuart monarchs, Charles II and James II, in the later part of the century, which led to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the establishment of constitutional monarchy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And I see that as I think it's a product of the adoption of coal, not simply an accidental co-traveler.
So it's really key what kind of energy we use. It's really key what you've been studying, and you have the data to show the costs and the limitations you have done an amazing amount of work. If we go to more and more renewables, or we're just going to be moving more workers into that area, not being able to live in our homes comfortably with heat and air conditioning, and the costs will be exorbitant. I mean, there's a lot at stake. I mean, even in developed, even in the OECD countries, not to mention the energy poverty in the developing countries that are prohibited from using fossil fuels for their betterment.
Yes, I'm very concerned about this. I don't want to be alarmist about it, but I do feel alarmed, in fact. I'm concerned that we don't really understand the critical relation between high-grade energy sources, not simply quantity, but high-grade, low-entropy sources, and the kind of sustained growth that we've observed in the West since the 16th and 17th centuries, certainly, and perhaps the roots of it even earlier than that. And by forcing in low-quality energy sources, what are we doing? Do we understand what we're doing? And I think we don't. I think we don't understand how we've got where we are today, and we don't understand what we're doing with renewables. Are we jeopardizing, are we destabilizing a complex system that may be very difficult to return to a path of sustained growth? I mean, let's be, historical about this. I mean, all societies on record have been going into sustained growth, but they don't actually sustain it. They fall back. So you see an exponential curve, which then falls back. All we can say at present is that our own exponential growth curve hasn't stopped yet. There's nothing to say it won't. And I think we are possibly, as I say, I don't wish to be alarmist and I don't want to be too assertive about it, but I think there are good theoretical and empirical grounds for thinking that unless we maintain the high quality of energy inflow into our societies, that we may destabilize our growth patterns. We may see uncontrollable collapses in overall societal wealth, which would be disastrous for everybody.
Well, so much of the authoritarian world is banking on that for the West.
And they're using fossil fuels. Yes.
And they're using fossil fuels as if
absolutely. Yes, well, I've said this in print, but the engineer bureaucrats of Beijing understand thermodynamics a great deal better than the lawyers in the White House. An unfortunate and bitter truth, but I'm afraid it is a truth. They understand it very well. And indeed, if you look at the energy consumption curves for the OECD states, and particularly for the EU and the UK, and even latterly for the US, what you see is that our energy consumption has faltered, flatlined, and is now even declining since 2005, thereabouts, 2005-06, just before the economic turbulence. I think that's historically unprecedented. I don't think we've seen this kind of faltering and decline since the medieval period. It's a little bit too soon to say that with real certainty. I mean, there have been big slumps in the past. The Depression produced a big slump in the US curve, for example. You can see it very clearly. But I'm concerned about it, and I don't think we should be complacent about it. It's affecting many different countries. The EU, all the EU states show it, the UK particularly prominently, and even in the US. And one thing those countries all have in common is they're all trying aggressively to adopt renewables as a means to reduce emissions. Countries which are not aggressively adopting renewables in those sort of quantities, in Asia, for example, are not exhibiting the same faltering decline pattern in energy consumption. I think what we've done, we've made our energy systems unproductive and expensive, and we've introduced price rationing to our consumers. And so we're actually suppressing the consumption of energy in those systems. And I suspect it simply means that wealth is now beginning to decline. I see some evidence of declining wealth, not simply in spending patterns, but also, for example, in faltering improvements in human lifespan in the UK. So since about 2000, which is when we really started on renewables, human longevity has not been increasing as fast, and it's slightly puzzling. And one possible explanation is that we're not seeing the increasing energy consumption that you need to have to keep on improving the well-being of your population.
And when did energy consumption start to fall off? And is it more significant in Europe than it is in the rest of the world?
I think it is, and the patterns, the charts are fairly clear. You can go onto the International Energy Agency website and have a look at the figures for yourself. It flatlines from about 2000, falls off in 2008. Well, that's an economic turbulence, so you can't draw any firm conclusions from it. But you'll see that the curves then tail away. And in the UK, it's really quite marked. And so we're back to energy consumption levels that we haven't seen since the 1990s, which is quite concerning. And that's true also in electricity, very marked in electricity. Now, some people will say, well, this is energy efficiency measures, perhaps. But actually, there are very good theoretical grounds for rejecting that. This was pointed out by the German chemist Justus von Liebig and William Stanley Jevons, W.S. Jevons, in the 19th century, that conservation of energy and efficiency are entirely distinct concepts and not to be confused. So if you improve the efficiency of a process, more of that process will be used. If that demand for that process is not elastic, the energy will simply be economized for somewhere else in the system. So efficiency improvements cause increases in overall energy consumption. That is inevitable. So if you see reductions in energy consumption, it's caused by something else. It's not efficiency. Efficiency measures may help you offset conservation, which is caused by something else, but efficiency measures do not actually reduce energy consumption. They cause it to increase, in fact. So yes, we are improving the efficiency in Europe, and that is offsetting the effect of our declining, our increasing costs, but it's not actually causing the reduction in consumption. Something else is causing the consumption reduction, and I think that's increasing cost.
And wealth, as you say this, you see the wealth slipping. You see wealth slipping.
I see it.
In countries that are headlong.
I think I can detect it, but obviously, I may be experiencing confirmation bias here. I think we need to be cautious about interpreting the data. But the longevity data is interesting. And impressionistically, one has the feeling, looking around the European states, that they have problems in maintaining the quality of their infrastructure. I mean, and that is true, sadly, in the United States as well. I mean, the United States electricity grid, for example, is notoriously in need of rebuilding, and we see that too here in the UK. So yes, I think that there is evidence, but I want to be cautious about it. I don't want to be panicky about this. I'm still trying to find clearer and more reliable and subjective evidence of declines in wealth, but there's sufficient there for me to be concerned. I'm just simply saying, let's not be complacent about this.
Okay, yeah. So looking ahead, what are some of the new thoughts and issues? I know you've talked a lot about them, and your published papers are evidence of the malfunctioning, the utter disaster of wind and solar. What can be our new direction? Where can and should we be heading?
Well, as they say,
and for British, and for
all of us, yes. Well, we wouldn't start from here, ideally. I mean, we have a legacy problem to deal with. We have very large fleets of renewables which are heavily subsidized, where they've got legal entitlements. How do we unwind all that so that we can then design a better system? It's going to be extremely difficult. We were on a gas to nuclear trajectory in the early 2000s in the UK. We were increasingly adopting natural gas for electricity generation. We'd already converted domestic heating to natural gas, and our industrial process heat was increasingly delivered by natural gas rather than coal. And that was generating wealth. It was a rich and prosperous country, and we had plans for nuclear for the longer term. That was a very sensible long-term strategy. And it's still a sensible long-term strategy. I mean, I think we have to try and get back to the early 2000s and get ourselves back onto that track before Tony Blair put us onto the renewables track. It was his idea, in fact, and I think a grave national strategic error to do this. So gas to nuclear is the overall objective. Unwinding the renewables so that you can actually have a successful gas to nuclear strategy is the short-term policy difficulty. And I'm not shy about recommending coal now, because I think the problems are so acute that we have to be realistic and say, well, undesirable it may be, but we should have some ultra supercritical coal, at least in planning, should the nuclear policies not be delivered in time. And when I say nuclear, I'm not simply thinking about electricity. I am very interested in the provision of high-grade heat from high-temperature nuclear reactors, not PWRs. PWRs are quite cool, thinking these are advanced gas-cooled reactors. And there are some operational around the world. Japan has a very interesting one. Temperatures are high, 700 to 900 degrees centigrade. So once you've got high-grade heat like that, that's the thermodynamic holy grail. You can do almost anything you want with high-grade heat. And there's a possibility here that in addition to generate electricity, if you want to, you can also use that high-grade heat to decompose seawater to produce hydrogen. And then you've got another universal energy carrier, which you can use as an alternative, for example, to gasoline in combustion engines, or if you want to use it in fuel cells. So I think it's very interesting, but I mean, this is speculative. It's a way off, but we shouldn't think of nuclear purely in terms of electricity, but it is a very interesting option for high-grade heat as well. But getting there, well, we have to be wealthy. We have to be wealthy and clever. And that means making the most of the fossil fuels that we have in the short term. And we should use them wisely and very effectively, generate as much human intelligence, as much sophisticated capital equipment, so that we can smoothly move to the next very low entropy source, which is available to us in nuclear energy.
Well, we really appreciate your sharing here and your time. We happen to feel here in the U.S., at least in our basin, we produce some of the cleanest hydrocarbons in the world, from an emission and regulatory and use of the land perspective. We just, I think we're on top. We used to call it the cheap blue flame, and I think it still is the cheap blue flame for natural gas in the U.S. But, a lot of that's going to be certifiably green. We think that's an option too. So, any words of wisdom for E&Ps, for domestic U.S. producers? Final thought there, John.
Don't let the environmentalists demoralize you. As you say, you're a relatively clean industry. You're delivering tremendous amounts of human well-being. Be proud of what you're doing and fight your corner with all vigor, because the well-being of human populations around the world are depending on you to a very large degree and will continue to depend on you. So fight back and fight with courage. Okay, well, thank you. Well, we've appreciated your taking your time this afternoon, I think in Suffolk, where you're from in England. And that's right. I know you're on to something here tonight, so we want to wrap up here. So again, thank you very much. It's very, very, very interesting and awesome discussion for our IQ today. Thank you very much, Jerry. Been a pleasure. Definitely. So next month we'll have May 10th. We're going to move it up a week because I'm going to be out of town on the 17th. So we'll stay informed on the internet as to where we are with that. In June, we have Tom Petrie on the June solstice, June 21st, Tuesday, 9 a.m. Tom Petrie has been in M&A for his entire career in mainly the oil and gas business, but energy as well. I heard Tom a couple of weeks ago said, we are facing our most challenging time since World War II. So Tom on June 21st. Again, thank you to all of you for letting me take the reins here on these important discussions, and any suggestions, comments. We love to hear the feedback. So I enjoy this a lot. Best get back to my regular job here at San Juan Resources. So again, John Constable, thank you. We'll stay in touch. For over 50 years, Process Equipment and Service Company, or PESCO, has been proudly designing, building, and maintaining production equipment for its customers. Located in Farmington, New Mexico, PESCO sells and services units from across the western United States, from large majors to small independents like San Juan Resources. PESCO is proud to sponsor the Energy IQ, and they look forward to working with you, supporting the San Juan Basin community in any way they can. Whiptail Midstream operates crude oil, natural gas, and water gathering systems in the San Juan Basin to handle growing production from the Manga Shale. With more than 500 miles of well-positioned infrastructure, Whiptail is capable of delivering 38,000 barrels of oil per day, 100 million cubic feet of natural gas per day, while gathering and safely disposing of 8,000 barrels per day of produced water.
Hooktail is an energetic and innovative company, is happy to support improving our energy IQ.